Good afternoon, Kishan.
Good afternoon, Floris.
So today we have an article from one Facebook engineer, but the engineering team or the analytics team published it on Medium. And it is about, or they call it the second brain for knowledge workers. So they implemented, and let's call it, or in layman terms, I call it an AI infrastructure. So they can access many different applications and databases and all kinds of knowledge that they have in their organization, which was, as they call it, fragmented. I think we discussed these things a couple of times already, the type of work that they have been doing or what they have been writing about. Could you maybe explain a bit about, in general, what they have done in layman terms, how this works, and what their objective with this project is or was?
I think the objective was very simple, is to have a coherent knowledge of all the different projects and status of these different projects and the work that has been going on inside of these different projects throughout the company. So basically a shared knowledge that you know what your coworker has been doing or what your coworker is progressing on. You don't have to give all the context up front with every session that you start one of these agents. Normally, what you have to do if you don't have any of these infrastructures, either write all the context by yourself so the agent knows what you're doing or what you already have done or what you already have decided, or you have to keep track of files and share those files across the team to make sure that everything stays in sync. So what they have done is basically centralize this file structure of all these Claude files, session files, context files in their shared drive, and then build a whole bunch of connectors to connect to the systems that they use to be able to interface with them using, in this case, Claude.
Can you explain a bit about, because you introduced the 4-layer model, which I think has a significant overlap with their model. Essentially, I think it's very similar. They use the para structure, which stands for projects, areas, resources, and archive. Can you maybe walk us through about the different, they say it has 4 main pieces. Can you walk us through the main pieces?
So it's from a method that organizes your own personal information, basically a methodology to organize your own projects and thoughts as a human being. But apparently they found that this type of model to structure knowledge also works for an agent. So it's not that different in the sense that what we have used at Eli 5, the 4-layer model, and this, but this is more scoped, I think, to a broader set of items that have a very common direction. So in this case, analytics, everything it does is understandable by the analytics team and used by the analytics team. And it has all that context and all the different areas of expertise, the different resources to work with everything, and the projects that are either now on top of mind or in the sense of that's archived, that all the knowledge is coherent and put in a place that doesn't need to be accessible immediately, but it has the legacy knowledge of certain things that happen. That's the understanding behind this model.
And so what I think almost maybe a year ago or maybe even longer, MCP came out where you can have a connector that a language model can connect to any application. I was wondering, where is the term, or at least the term before that was vector database, that was super relevant and important. Where is that in all this infrastructure? Is that gone, or how does that work?
I don't think it's used anymore as prevalently. So it is used for finding ways through a lot of knowledge or making links between a giant knowledge base. The context windows of these models are so huge that you can put almost everything of all the knowledge that you have for either a certain project, a certain framework, a certain interface into the context window. And it still has enough space to work normally with the work you want to do. So I think the whole premise around vector databases and retrieval augmented generation, so RAG, is still there. It's just not as necessary anymore because of these giant context windows that we have nowadays.
Okay, clear. And with regards to the agent orchestration, we have been reviewing OpenClaw, but also Hermes. To my not so much surprise, but I saw that there's not really such an orchestration layer that they picked from the shelf, right? I didn't see it in the article. Did they build something themselves then, or?
They build their own skills. If you have really scoped work, or you have a set way of working that everyone has to use, such as in analytics team, everybody has to do or follow a certain SOP to do the work, and use certain connectors, use certain links, use certain credentials to do and to retrieve all the data you need. I think it's quite overkill to introduce something new, because with writing skills and adding these infrastructure elements to build these connectors, you're already very much ahead. You don't need something new.
Is everything from a configuration perspective, like for example, user management and that kind of stuff? User management may be something different, but is the configuration, the setup, so to speak, is that in Claude Code and everything is there in GitHub, or how does that work from a settings or a setup perspective? Where's the overview?
I think it's both. I think it's both in every repository somewhere, because that's where the skills are. That's where the descriptions are, what Cloud Code in this case needs to do. And also the descriptors of what the CLIs are that they have, what kind of MCP servers they have. All that stuff is in a file somewhere. But then you also have the part next to that is the internal infrastructure, what databases there are, how to connect to those. And I think that lives somewhere else. That lives in internal systems.
Right, because also tied to the software modernization service that Eli 5 provides, I think this is something that almost all companies want to have. Some can have it because they have been, or either have been, they are new, so they have no legacy systems or infrastructure, or they have been staying very keen on modernizing. Probably with Meta did that also. I suppose they have a lot of money, so they can keep on modernizing their systems and making sure that everything stays connected. That I found interesting is also they mentioned that also it became really big, the adoption rate. They have an image about the adoption rate where even like execs adopt this project, and where everyone is working also to maintain and improve it, which is obviously also something that if you build any tool that with these capabilities is super important. But the premise to be able to do this, and I think it's also quoted somewhere in the article where it says the one investment that made this possible was authenticated access to internal tools. That really sounds to me like, yeah, the premise that we also discussed a lot of times with the software modernization. You can't have this type of stuff without having the infrastructure modernized and certain applications, right?
Yeah, that's key. I think it says somewhere in the article that infrastructure is key in this. You need access to the internal systems. You need access to data. You need all the knowledge somewhere in place in a structured manner, so the agent knows what to do and where to call different things. It's impossible to do without this knowledge. Else, there's no two companies alike. Every company has its own process, its own systems, and its own way of working. If we don't document that somewhere accessible for an agent, or if you don't give it access to the data that you need, or if you don't give it access to, for example, Google Drive or an internal knowledge system such as Confluence, it can never retrieve anything to do the work. So that's definitely key. But that's also the most difficult part of this, is exposing data and exposing it in a manner that an agent can work with it. So that means building CLIs, building MCPs, or structuring the data in a way that it is accessible.
And did you read or did you understand the concept on the progressive disclosure that they mentioned, that it says that they don't feed an agent everything at once, but as that would be great output, they load a root file and then drill down on the demand. How is that? Does that work? Is it the initial question is analyzed and then it goes from there, or is it sort of logic reasoning?
I don't think that's built in anywhere. That's an inherent thing of reasoning built into these models, is that it uses the superficial knowledge that it has right now and tries to use the tools and skills that it has to retrieve more knowledge from it. That's the whole idea behind the reasoning in these newer models. So it tries to keep asking questions and try to find the answers to make a better answer or decision.
Yeah, makes sense. What I wanted to add to the last question or the last discussion that we had on the infrastructure, I suppose this is also this from Meta Analytics, which is then probably humongous business unit inside Meta, but it probably helps also for this whole initiative that it is a separate business unit that has control over what and access to all these different components, and then they have a sort of very specific, although very big, a very specific objective within Meta, right? So that's probably also something that helps.
I think so. Meta is a huge company and it's global, and every country has its own business unit as well for certain functionalities. It's impossible to do this on a global level for everyone, especially because even if it was fragmented within one business unit, can you imagine what happens all around the world? But for smaller companies, this is very doable if you spend some effort to structure your data and expose it and structure your processes and document those. Then you have a very good start. It won't do everything probably what this does, but it will get you ahead.
I find also the setup and the way they talked about it, how they build it, it's surprisingly easy, but obviously that is because of their infrastructure and their engineering capabilities. So it really advocates, I think, also I think many organizations can have benefits from this type of setup, but then it shows that you really need the engineers to not only set it up, but also maintain it. probably not a full-time job afterwards, but if you want to improve in, yeah, I suppose new models come out. So you want to swap models, maybe you have new tools that need to be introduced. So this is a never ending story in a sense, up until the moment that maybe the model itself can improve the system. But
Yeah, but that's like any software. This is also software built to do something with an agent. It needs maintenance. It needs upkeep.
what I liked about the article is that it also shows comments, and one comment, I think a valid point, it says that at a certain time, the second brain, or the AI second brain, can also scale centralized errors. Like, and then that becomes filed, and that becomes institutional memory. It's not addressed, says the commenter on in this article, is not addressed at all. So how, this is a governance question, but how would we govern that if there is errors centralized and stored, and then it becomes memory? That's the challenge, right?
Yeah, that's like any documentation. The documentation, if it stays still, it will continue to be what it always was. If it doesn't get reviewed for changes, errors, or updates, or things that are moving through time, it stays something that is documented, and maybe people take it as the truth, but might not necessarily be that way anymore. How can you address this? Like any documentation, basically periodic reviews, whether it be by a review agent that doesn't have the context of this, but tries to find truth in the documentation, or by human review. It's the thing is that this goes very deep with also very specific project related how-tos, from what I understand. We don't document that far because that's most of the agents can infer from the general 4 layers that we have what they would need to do. If we started telling them to do certain things a certain way and there's a bug or an error in that way of working that we put as truth or as a guideline, yes, you can institutionalize that way of working as an error for everyone involved. But I think that there needs to be a balance between documenting everything and every way you want an agent to work, or just giving it specific guidelines to how you want the output to be and let the agent infer the rest from your knowledge.
Are you surprised in any way that Meta has its own model? Yeah. From this, I can infer that the Claude and that Anthropic has a better model. Or
I find it curious that they didn't use Meta's own models. Yes, of course, because they have one. They update it quite frequently, but apparently even their internal team doesn't use it for whatever reason. I don't know. That also isn't addressed anywhere.
I suppose that is something interesting that they could publish the article. It went through the PR engine, or I suppose then the model of Claude or Anthropic is significantly better, or maybe easier to use, or maybe the Claude code plus the model is the thing that sets it apart.
I find it curious that Meta seems to be one of the bigger companies that has their own models but don't use their own models. There was a news item I think a week ago that Google also cut them off from Gemini usage because they were using it too much, which they have their own model. They should use that probably, right? There was also pretty much a lot of news coming out that their own employees are recorded on how to do certain things to feed into this model. So it should theoretically, if the training data is there, be pretty good. But I don't know why. I can speculate like anyone could, but we don't know. But I think one thing is interesting from this graph is that even if you build something that works, it doesn't get adopted until somebody makes it easy to access. Like the PM's viral post, like it said here, he basically made it accessible and showed what it can do and how to set it up in the easiest way possible. So even if you build a tool that does everything it needs to do and don't involve the users or don't make it easy to access, nobody is using it. Because apparently things didn't really change between the launch in December and then the viral post in February.
Yeah, that's a sort of a pilot period. And I suppose it's interesting that you have such a large audience that you can grow towards. But I see here API rate limits, and I suppose I know what that means, that they used they burn too many tokens but if you have 60,000 people, of which a part probably uses it daily, this is probably a very significant cost on the balance sheet, right?
Not only for Claude, you have to imagine you also probably get bills for the APIs that you use to access your tooling. Because you also need to access your data through an API. You also need to access Google Drive through an API. I don't think Google's going to be happy with a couple million calls to Google Drive just to fetch your knowledge. So API rate limits can be anywhere, not only from Claude.
True.
Because Claude, if you hit API rate limits in Claude, you probably also hit API rate limits in the systems that Claude tries to access.
And do you think would there be an option? This is also for like the future, also in the sense of when doing modernization work with, from a strategic perspective, wanting to have something like this in the future, it makes sense. We had the discussion also in the office about local processing or local language models that do processing, and then not so to decrease the token spend. I suppose, but there are so many downsides to do the local processing. Maybe not when you do it on your own machine, but what are the options there? What do you see in the near future on for companies that want to have something like this? They know now that probably the subscriptions and the API costs are subsidized, so the cost will probably go higher. The usage will become even more, so the cost will spiral out of control. What are the scenarios that you see to decrease the cost or at least keep it in control?
Honestly, I don't think much is going to change just because of the ease of access and use that a service like a subscription or an API with an API key delivers. You only need 2 clicks to get to any of the models nowadays. You need to pay for it, yes, but you just need 2 clicks. If you want to host your own model, you need to know the software, you need to know what type of model file to use, you need to know it will probably eat all your RAM. So you don't really have much space to do anything else. It will be really slow, or you need dedicated machines to do that. But that also makes you a power user and not just any user. So I think for companies that have dedicated people that know about system administration and setting up hardware and all this kind of things, they have an opportunity, of course, to load their own models. But then they come into the second conundrum. The frontier models are probably never going to go open source. So you will always be behind in capabilities. So either you train your own, you build your own capabilities on top of these models, or you just eat the bill and get the capabilities you want.
And I suppose that they're using frontier models in combination. You have different models, obviously, like Fable is super expensive, but very good. You can offload work probably even to like from a super good model for expensive, for difficult work, and like a cheaper model, and even then a local model, you could also like, make it work like that, right? That they work together.
Exactly. And that's also I think the whole premise around this is to do the difficult thinking work with a more expensive model and let the output be generated by cheaper models. But that's also, for example, the bots that we created yesterday. It's what it does. It does the difficult grading work upfront with the more expensive model and lets the cheaper models do all the nitty gritty stuff, because that's just a lot cheaper and you can just invoke hundreds of them and it will just run at a fraction of the cost. Because right now the frontier model is Fable while recording this, which is I think 10 times more expensive than the cheaper Haiku model, or Sonnet is I think it's 4 times more expensive. I'm not sure about the numbers, but it is more expensive.
Yeah, we'll see how it evolves, but it is interesting that even the cheaper models are pretty good nowadays. So it will probably only get better, and you need to get your wallet for the newest models every time that they launch, obviously.
Yeah, it's just that people expect a lot from just one prompt, and that's the more expensive models are going to give you better results. But if you distill it into scoped tasks, the cheaper models will also just work just fine.
And like from maybe a closing question in the sense, is the honest takeaway of this article that AI for, at least for Meta, was the easy part, and they have spent a lot of time the last decade to do all the modernization work or already be modernized in a sense? Would that be an honest takeaway that this is for them very easy to do, but for an average other company it would be super difficult?
I'm not sure if that would be the takeaway, because I don't think it's easy for them as well. They just have more capabilities. They have a bigger team. They have more tech savvy people. The whole company is built around technology, in modern technology. It doesn't exist that long, right? And it was built for the internet. So I think the whole modernization question there was not really a question. It was already pretty modern to start with. But I do think the takeaway can be is that you need to have your systems in order and accessible and maintained somehow. You need to have your processes documented somewhere and accessible to be able to build upon it with an agent. Else it will not do what you want because it doesn't have the knowledge. I think that's the main takeaway. This is more just a happy post that they have a lot of adoption with these things. But for any other company, I think the more important thing is this. I think if you scroll down, there's a couple of points that they are making. Here, if you scroll up a bit, the first point is the most important one, is that infrastructure here. What we learned, infrastructure comes first. I think that's the most important takeaway of this entire article is you need to build access, you need to build tooling, you need to build something to do the work a human would do as an agent.
That would then for an average company be 80% of the work, especially if you have probably now after a Meta, I suppose, many of the how-to guides and all these forward deployed engineers come out of the woodwork and say, okay, we can fix that AI part for you if you have the infrastructure ready to go. I suppose that is the case, right?
Yeah, or the forward deployed engineers nowadays are so varied that they can also build the infrastructure for you. That's probably where it's going to go ahead.
That was, I think, the conclusion of last article, a review, that is maybe their secret revenue model or something that they definitely are going to do, like the modernization. And again, indeed, it shows that if Meta says that, it shows that all the companies that want to have this really need to do the infrastructure first, and that will be done by forward deployed engineering types. Then, is there anything else that we want to discuss on this? I don't think so. Do you have any other additions to what we have been discussing?
No, I think this was a pretty good article, pretty good overview of what they did and how to do it properly. But it also, I think it's nice that it shows that if you build something and put it out there, doesn't necessarily mean that your people are going to use it. You need to guide them or show them and involve them.
The nice thing, I think, from the simple infrastructure perspective, or at least the simple architectural perspective, is that you have something that everyone can work on, or at least the engineers, most of the engineers can work or contribute on. And you have a sort of base that only becomes better longer the period of time the time goes on, and it's more and more is added and contributed. As long as the model can grasp everything, then the whole system only becomes better, right?
Yeah, and if it stays maintained, maybe if the model doesn't grasp everything anymore, there are probably other tools to make the interface between the knowledge and the model better to improve that whole process.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks for your time, Kishan.
Thank you, Floris.